Okay, our next presenters are going to be Gretchen Krivak. She is a professor in the Nutrition and Public Health Department, and Carol Burtnack, also in the Public Health, Nutrition, and Wellness Department. Both are teachers, and both are fitness experts, too. Welcome.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So the reason why we have some guests up here is because March is National Nutrition Month. So it's a month to celebrate all things nutrition. That's through the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. So Gretchen and I are both registered dietitians with interests in sports. So when we heard this theme for this year, Go Further with Food, I thought, what's more appropriate than running 100 miles and going that far as physical activity, which one of our guests has done. So that's how we kind of came to this topic of using food as the fuel to go further and use it to fuel physical activity and making informed choices about how to go about doing that.
So our objectives for this session, we're going to be interviewing some ultra-endurance athletes here, and they both are on our campus, so you'll get to know them here in a moment. But we're going to talk specifically to them about how they go further with their food. And we're going to talk about the timing of fuel and the quality of fuel and quantity. So that's what really makes athletes unique in terms of the amount of food they need to eat. The timing of food is different than what individuals who are not training for events are going to be. And we'll talk quickly about the quality of food. So that's really going to be the focus.
All right, so I have the pleasure of introducing our first athlete, Laura Malcolm. So she is an Ironman athlete. So Laura, tell us a little bit about how you got into that sport and maybe tell us what that is exactly.
Sure. Well, I've been racing triathlon since 2012, and this is my third year racing the full Ironman distance. An Ironman triathlon consists of a 2.4-mile swim, a 112-mile bike ride, and then a full marathon, which is 26.2-mile run. Typically, you have 17 hours or under to complete that, so it's a full-day endurance event. And as far as getting into it, I have to give some credit to my parents, because when I grew up, it was not uncommon to see my mom go out for a couple of miles running around the neighborhood, or to see my dad go out of the house for lap swimming or go for a bike ride. So I kind of grew up around that active influence. And when I came here to Andrews University as a student, I started doing a swimming class here at the pool, which got me into lap swimming. I started doing some local 10Ks, ended up doing a marathon my senior year of college, and started bike riding, did a couple 100-mile century rides, and then a friend who was a triathlete said, you should try that. So I put the three sports together and did a couple of triathlons and fell in love with it. I love how much it can push you to your limits and challenge you and just get you outside in that active, beautiful scenery and environment.
Thank you.
Our next guest is Oliver Glanz. He originally is a mountaineerer, so he can tell us a little bit about that, but now has become an ultra-endurance athlete. So Oliver, tell us a little bit about how you got into these sports as well.
Right, so my hobby is really mountaineering. That's where my soul and my heart is. But when I moved here to Michigan, I'm originally from Europe, there were no mountains here, so I thought I need to find something else that might simulate, in a sense, the challenges that come with mountaineering, and so somehow come up with the idea with ultramarathoning. So I'm running together with a friend of mine. We're running ultramarathon distances. That means that basically any distance beyond the 26-mile distance is an ultramarathon. So we ran a couple of 50-milers, 60-milers, 100-miler, some 70-milers. So that's basically what we're doing, and the motivation behind it. It's kind of difficult. You do not always know why you do things, but I think when I reflect on particularly why we do mountaineering or why I'm doing mountaineering, I think there are three major topics. The one is freedom, a sense of freedom, and I get this from running as well. It's basically this idea of You don't need a car, you don't need a taxi, you don't need a bus. You can just go whenever you want, wherever you want, you just run there. So it gives me a sense of autarky, a sense of self-destination, and that's just a great feeling, and it's inspirational. The second reason is, I think, a sense of purpose, namely in the sense that you need to become, you need to get to terms with pain. You are facing quite a lot of pain in these ultra marathons or even mountaineering, and to become friends with pain, to start learning how to cope with pain, gives you a sense of self-control. You're not afraid anymore of challenges, you're not afraid anymore of risk and pains. You have kind of developed a mechanism how to cope with it. And I'll leave it with that for now, yeah.
Okay, so our next question for our athletes is we'd like to know a little bit about your training schedule. How do you train for these types of events that you participate in? So if you both could answer, please.
Okay, well, with me, I start, my whole year is kind of broken into depending on which race I'm aiming for. So right now I'm training for Norseman, which is an Ironman distance race on very, very tough, hilly, and cold water terrain. So I'm kind of in my starting to build, get a lot of mileage phase, and then you kind of peak into it. My race is in August, so you build up your volume, build up your distance, start getting some more speed work in, and then after my race, I'm going to take some time off, have an off season, take a step back. I always just kind of cycle my year through this, really taking it easy, just not even worrying about workouts or exercising or anything, and then getting the mileage up and building and peaking. So my weekly schedule, when you're looking at 3 sports, it tends to be a lot of 2-a-days. I work full time, so I'll get up in the morning, 5 a.m., go for a swim, usually twice a week. When the weather starts getting warmer and we have the lakes not frozen, I'll also throw in a couple evening swims in open water swims in the lakes. I bike, usually 2 shorter sessions, and then a long session. I'll be building up to 100 to 145 miles for my long rides. And then running, I do what we call brick workouts, which stands for bike, run, ick, for the feeling you get in your legs after you try running after a bike ride. Also do some speed work. I'll be doing a lot more hills to prepare for the hills, and then a long run. I do strength training a couple of times a week as well, just to make sure I'm staying fit in that area, and it's actually really helpful to my performance to throw in strength training. So.
Yeah, I think for me it is much more simple because I don't participate in competitions, so I don't need to high peak at a certain level in my season. I hardly train really, I basically just commute, so that's my training, you would say. So every day I'm commuting a round trip 11 miles, usually running to school and back. Often I use it as family time with my daughter. She has to go to school, so she bikes and I run besides my daughter, drop her at school and then continue running. So that means when I have a normal school semester where I'm teaching, I run per week about 40-50 miles just in order to get to work. Now, when I do have to prepare for an event, whether that's mountaineering, for example, climbing a high mountain, I do, of course, incorporate strength training, do some climbing sessions and pull-ups, push-ups, core trainings to make sure I'm fit for the climbing section of the mountain. When I'm preparing for a good time for an ultra marathon. Usually, like I said, I'm not participating in events, I just go, but I want to get a good time. Then indeed I have to develop what I'm usually doing, a 2-3 intense week, and then a recover week, and then again a 2 to 3 week intense week, and then a recover week. So for example, when I prepared for the 100-miler, that would mean that a month before I would kind of start peaking at my performance level. So a long, intense week would end with about miles, I think it's 80, 90 miles that I would run. And in an easy week, I would perhaps just run 10 miles, but bike a lot, or do core trainings, or just rest. I think one of the most important things is rest, to have the body rest. That's where the body does not just regenerate, but actually builds a lot of stamina and strength.
Yeah, and I want to add to what Oliver said with the rest. I forgot to mention that I always take a rest day every single week, and I just think that's a part that often gets overlooked when athletes are trying to peak for a performance, how important it is to take a recovery week and a rest day.
Yeah, the rest is a big key. We really want to make sure our athletes don't overtrain. So they're working hard, and obviously you probably think, how could they not overtrain, right, as much as they're doing? But those rest days are important, and then an off season is very important. So typically athletes will come up with a large cycle like Laura was explaining. She determines what are going to be her competition days, and then builds a plan based on that in terms of this is competition time, this is training, as I'm going to prepare for the competition, and then also some rest. So a lot of times we have like a prior to season, pre-season, the actual racing season, and then the off season. And then you can see training goals, body composition goals, and then nutrition plays into that as well. So we don't only want to break the cycles up in terms of their training, but nutrition is going to change during those cycles as well. They're not going to eat the same during the off season as they do during the training season or during competition. So it's important to have these cycles kind of broken down so they know their nutrient needs and then also training needs, so it all goes together and is mapped out. So you can see that it takes a lot of planning when you're an athlete in terms of nutrition and training.
So that leads into the fuel part. So one of the big things with overtraining, we do see that, exerting yourself too intensive a training program, all of the training that you're doing in preparation for an event or going out for a 100-mile run just for fun. But that's really important piece to give those rest days. But also we see one of the contributors of overtraining is inadequate fueling. Okay, so not eating enough of the energy or calories that your body requires to support that intense training schedule. So my question for the athletes, and Oliver, you may start since you're holding the microphone. So how do you feel nutrition affects your performance?
It's a big factor. I mean, it depends a little bit on the sport you're involved in. I think for Laura, it's quite a different mix of nutrition than it would be for an ultramarathon or for mountaineering. For example, when I'm going into high altitude mountaineering, you might be surprised, but I hardly eat anything for like 3-4 days. But the reason for that is that, and it might also be individual. Every body kind of is trained a little bit differently, but I think in my, let's say, non-scientific approach to what I think is happening is I kick in to a mode of high, fat burning mode when I'm going into the high altitude mountains, because it's not intense, fast, repetitive movement. It's more this meditative, continuous walking, going, climbing. So I think I'm probably starting to burn fat, and so you also at the high altitude you do not really have any appetite. So what you like in the valley, you might actually vomit up there. So I eat probably on a day 3 to 4 muesli bars, although I'm active 12-14 hours. Now this is high altitude mountaineering. When I'm doing an ultramarathon, it's a complete different thing. So when an ultramarathon, I need to make sure that about every 30 minutes I get fuel intake. And it could have different forms. For example, here these gels. Not every gel will work for everybody, but for me, these types of gels, they work very well. I need to make sure every 30 minutes I need to take something in. About every 3 hours of the run, I need to take solid food, like bean burritos in. It's important because otherwise you kind of get oversugared and you start throwing up. And you need this fuel that contains to be active in the body, so solid food is important. If you don't do that, you might feel fresh. Like in November, I ran the Boston Marathon back-to-back, so we started at the start line, we started at the finish line, running to the start line, and then running back to the finish line. And so on the last, we felt great. Kilometer 70, I started feeling, I should get something, but we're so close to the finish line. I'm bored, I don't want to take anything, and it worked fine. But for the last 4 kilometers, I was suffering so much, and the last 800 meters, I couldn't run. I was completely depleted. So I should have taken an energy gel. I just didn't feel like it's a stupid mistake, but after you've done them a couple of whiles, you know what you have to do. So keep fueling. You have to keep every 30 minutes for an ultramarathon. That might look different for Laura, though.
Yeah, it's actually similar in a lot of ways, though. Nutrition is vital when you're training to Ironman distance. They even say sometimes that nutrition is the 4th discipline: swim, bike, run, and nutrition. And like Oliver was saying, we call it bonking or hitting the wall, where you just completely lose energy and you just can't go and push yourself anymore. Some other potential problems that a lot of Ironman triathletes face is cramping. You could get quad cramps, leg cramps, you could get stomach cramps, or get some GI distress where you're running for the nearest tree or porta potty, whatever you can find. So it's really important, if you're looking to have a good and a fun race, to get your nutrition down. And for me, for my key race, it's even the weeks leading up to it, where I'm really trying to focus on clean eating, cutting out sugar as much as possible. A couple of days before the race, make sure I'm eating lower fiber, higher carb meals. And then during the race itself, make sure you get good pre-race, your pre-race routine in. And during a triathlon, it's a bit different because obviously you're not eating during the swim. And for me, on a run, maybe because you're running at a higher intensity in the marathon than you would for an ultra marathon, I can't do a bean burrito while running. The gels, I actually have a different kind of gel that works for me than Oliver, but the gels are great on runs. But the bike is where you get most of your nutrition in. So I'm eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, I'm eating crackers, I have some sweet options, I have salts, electrolytes, Gatorade. So it's really finding the mix on that works for you.
All right, so as we have seen, there's a lot of timing piece of when nutrients are coming in. There's during the exercise, which every sport has a little bit of different needs. The higher the intensity, usually the less food your stomach is going to be able to tolerate, simply because that's where the blood flow will go instead of going to your muscles, and that can cause the GI distress that Laura was talking about. But the pre-exercise meal that you are taking in, that also caters to what is going to happen during exercise. A lot of races start at a really early time in the morning, so that may make more of a difference as to what you are doing during your training exercise, and then of course the recovery nutrition, the post-exercise meal. So when we're looking at the types of fuel, so higher intensity such as the swim in the triathlon or the run, that carbohydrates becomes a very important fuel source. Fat is something that can be used as a fuel source for lower intensity, such as the mountaineering, that hiking, so your heart rate isn't as high. Your body is able to get oxygen to the cells so that they can use fat as a fuel source. So the demand for carbohydrates is a little bit different there. And then, of course, the quantity. We'll take a look at the end of the presentation about how an athlete's plate looks different. So moving along here.
Our next question is, can you tell us about your experience in testing some of the different fueling and hydration strategies? You've talked a little bit about it, but how do you kind of test out what works for you and what doesn't work?
Testing is key. There's a saying that you never ever try anything on race day because you'll regret it if you do. So for me, my strategy actually with nutrition is a lot more flexible than it sounds like probably what Oliver does and what some other athletes do. It really depends on you, what works for you, and you have to test that out and figure that out, because what I do could be a disaster for you. For some triathletes, I know there's a lot of discussion on nutrition, and for triathletes, you'll have people who are like, every 13 minutes I'm eating this, every 20 minutes this is the amount of Infinity mix or UCAN or Gatorade, whatever liquid mix I'm going to drink, and they have it all dialed in very specifically. I'm not like that. For me, I actually go a lot by just listening to my body and how I feel on race day. So I will pretty much eat on, like I said, bike is when I intake most of my food, but I will eat whenever I start even thinking about food or whenever I find even the slightest twinge of hunger. And I'll eat what I'm craving. So if it's salty, I'll go for the salty. If it's sweet, I'll go for the sweet. If it's solid food, I'll go for the sandwich. So that's why I carry a lot of different options with me on the bike. On the run, I do a bit more timing where every 6 miles or so, I'll do a gel. But you really just have to figure out what works for you. For me, that's worked. I've only messed up on a couple of races, and I know exactly what I did. One, I had a Cliff Bar, which I knew was a terrible idea because Cliff Bars have never worked for me in intense training, but I had it during the race and suffered. Another one was when I had Thai food the night before, and again, I knew that was a terrible idea because I never do spicy Thai food the night before, but I did, and I regretted it. So you just have to test it out.
And it also depends on the type of event, like the distance of the triathlon or the distance of the marathon or the type of mountain you're climbing. For example, when I'm preparing for a fast 10K, let's say a sub 40-minute 10K, I make sure that I hardly eat anything the night before, and then I just eat one banana before an hour before the race, and that works for me. That makes me run the fastest. So if I have a solid breakfast in the morning, it's not working. I'm going to get some aches and I'm not going to run fast. However, when I'm preparing for an ultra, then I make sure that I have a solid meal the last 2-3 days. We call it carb loading. So you make sure that you get all the carbs in and you replenish all the glucose storages that you have. And just the hour before, 2 hours before, I would have another solid meal, but the intensity of the running is a different nature. What is even more important in for some distances and some runs is really the electrolytes. So you can be well fueled with regard to carbs and sugars and these kind of things, but you could get knocked down just by a lack of salts. So especially when it's hot, I make sure I have some salt tablets with me. And as you said, I'm listening to the body. You feel when the urine gets kind of burny, then you know, okay, I need to drink and get salts. Otherwise, if you don't take salt and you continue drinking, you drink and you lose it. You drink and you lose it. So it's very important to keep the balance and to keep the muscles and the mind actually working to have salt in your body.
So as I highlighted, this is a very individualized plan. Everybody's going to be different. You have to test out the foods that work and don't work for you. Like Oliver said, bean burritos is something that he was eating on the 100-mile run. That may not work for everyone. That may give you GI distress. Thai food, that's Carol's go-to the night before. So it's funny how people all have different things that work and don't work for them. So it has to be an individualized plan. You need to test it out before you are, in that event, because so simulating the event as close to possible, including the weather conditions, the hilliness, all of those things are important. It's not always easy to do. Obviously, if you're like an Olympic athlete, I actually got to visit the Olympic Training Center. They're able to replicate conditions almost exactly in the Olympic training centers. They have rooms where they can change the altitude, the temperature, and so athletes can get an exact fueling plan, an electrolyte plan, a nutrition plan. So dietitians work with them on that in the exact kind of atmosphere they're going to be training in. Athletes like Laura and Oliver don't have the ability to do that, so they have to just, do the best that they can. But that's very important for athletes to test out whatever they're planning to eat. Don't go to any new foods on the day of the race, because usually you will suffer from it. So those are some of the keys.
All right, so just to kind of reiterate, and I think Laura and Oliver did a good job of mentioning some of their strategies as far as their pre-competition, pre-race, pre-run, pre-training fueling strategy. Again, it's individualized, but we want to make sure that they have enough energy, especially coming from carbohydrates. Usually we want the lower fiber complex carbohydrates so that the stomach isn't going to be upset during the competition that might be 2 to 4 hours later. So that becomes really important. The carbohydrates are really important for that high intensity, like the running, swimming, because that's what's providing the fuel for your muscles. So that carbohydrates actually get stored in your body, in your liver, and your muscles. So that's why we focus so much on getting that beforehand. We want to make sure that we're getting enough to delay the onset of exhaustion. So we see higher amounts of carbohydrates taken in athletes, their time to exhaustion, where they might be bonking or hitting the wall, having to fuel during their competition, is a longer duration. And then really important, making sure they're getting some hydration in. So a couple of cups of fluid beforehand, making sure they're not starting off dehydrated. That can also negatively impact performance. And then minimizing GI stress is a big one. That's very individualized. And then satisfying hunger. That's something that athletes usually have a pretty good attuned to, feeling those hunger signals and things, maybe not so much while they're in competition or while they're in a run or a race. That's why some athletes may have it timed down to the minute, but usually hunger beforehand is something that we want to make sure that that isn't going to be a distraction from the event.
One of the other big keys with athletes is fueling after exercise. So a lot of times, as soon as you're done with exercise, you don't feel hungry. We need our athletes to eat right away. So there's a 30-minute window, and then there's a 2-hour window where your glycogen stores can be replenished. And so it's really important. These athletes are training every single day. Laura's training sometimes 2 times a day. Even Oliver's doing 2 runs a day. To have energy for the next exercise session, you have got to get fuel in after the current exercise session. So that's really important so that they can continue to train at the highest possible energy level that they can. We need them to get that fuel in. Carbohydrates are really important right after exercise, as are protein. We haven't talked about protein much at all. This is where the protein comes in, okay? Helps build those stores back up, builds the muscle back up. So we want protein, carbs right after exercise, within 30 minutes, if possible, getting something in, like a snack, and then having a meal within the next 2 hours after you're done exercising is important. Also, hydration is important, so getting more fluids in, electrolytes are key, and then, again, you see this all throughout, is avoiding GI distress. So figuring out what foods work for you after a competition or after training is important, so that we're keeping the GI working and we're not making that too upset. So that's another really important key. What? Oh, that means good. You want to be in a good hydration status. So not dehydrated would be underhydration. Euhydration means you're good, you're balanced. Yes.
All right, to sum up, a comparison of quantity of how an athlete has to fuel, and sometimes an athlete's first full-time job is the training, the second full-time job is the fueling. Okay, I've heard athletes say, can't I just open my stomach and put the food right in there because I'm exhausted from eating? But if you're to compare a 150-pound non-athlete, recommended 2,000 calories, that's how we measure energy, compared to a same weight individual who's training moderately hard to hard range, they're going to need significantly more calories, anywhere between 2,500 to 3,800 calories. And you can see the MyPlate visualization differs quite a bit. So they are definitely taking in more of those carbohydrate foods that are made up of a lot of times those starchy vegetables, the grains that we see on the MyPlate visualization. And then you'll see the comparison of both protein and carbohydrates are fairly significant. The fat is the same. But when you're looking at the grams of protein significantly higher for an athlete who is using their muscles, there's more demand for muscle synthesis. And then you can see the carbohydrates, non-athlete under 300 grams per day, an athlete anywhere up to 600 grams per day, depending on where in their training cycle they are and what exactly their sport is. But this is for endurance athletes.
All right, we thank our guests for joining us, and thank you so much.